April 16, 1945, Thuringia, Germany. The blackened silhouettes of bombed-out buildings stood like jagged teeth against the grey spring sky as Frau Margarete Hoffmann clutched her two young children to her chest in the damp cellar of what remained of their home in Nordhausen. She believed, as did most of her neighbors, that the approaching American troops, particularly the Schwarze Soldaten, would bring nothing but more suffering to their already devastated community. The posters and whispered warnings had made that clear. Yet in the coming days, these same feared soldiers would become the unlikely saviors of dozens of German children, including her own, challenging everything she had been led to believe. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how propaganda-fueled fear gave way to reluctant gratitude, and eventually to a profound re-examination of deeply ingrained prejudices during the final desperate days of the Third Reich. The sirens had finally stopped. After nearly 6 years of war, Margaret Hoffmann had learned to distinguish between the various alarms, air raid warnings, all clear signals, and now the long, uninterrupted wail that meant enemy ground forces were approaching. At 32, Margaret's once youthful face had hardened into permanent worry lines. Her husband Klaus had been reported missing on the Eastern Front 2 years earlier, leaving her alone to care for 8-year-old Johann and 6-year-old Elsa in the increasingly desperate conditions of Hitler's crumbling Reich. "Mutti, I'm cold," Elsa whimpered, her small frame shivering despite the 3 layers of clothing Margareta had managed to scavenge. "Hush now," Margaret whispered, pulling her daughter closer. "We must be very quiet. Remember what I told you about the Americans?" Johann nodded solemnly, reciting the warnings that had been drilled into every German child through schools, posters, and radio broadcasts. "They are our enemies, especially the black ones. Herr Müller says they're savages who will steal children." Margaret nodded, though a flicker of doubt crossed her face. Over the past weeks, whispered conversations among the women waiting in ration lines had begun to contradict the official warnings. Stories were spreading about American soldiers, even the black ones, handing out chocolate to children in towns they had already captured. But Margaret couldn't afford to take chances with her children's lives. The cellar sheltered 3 other families from their apartment building: the elderly Schmitz, the pregnant Frau Weber and her toddler, and the Meyers with their teenage daughter Lena. Each family kept to their own corner, sharing what little food remained while the sounds of artillery fire grew steadily closer. 5 kilometers away, Technical Sergeant James Deacon Wilson of the 761st Tank Battalion, part of the 1st All-Black Armored Unit in the U.S. Army, stood atop his Sherman tank surveying the outskirts of Nordhausen through binoculars. At 25, Wilson had already seen more combat than most men would in a lifetime. The 761st, nicknamed the Black Panthers after their insignia, had fought their way through France and Belgium, proving their worth despite the prejudice they faced from both enemies and allies. "What do you see, Deacon?" asked Private First Class Marcus Taylor, the tank's ammunition loader, using Wilson's nickname earned from his habit of quietly reciting prayers before combat. "Town's been hit hard by our bombers," Wilson replied, lowering the binoculars. "Lot of rubble, not much movement." "Bet they're hiding and waiting for us," said Corporal Henry Jackson, the driver. "You know what kind of stories Jerry's been telling about us." Wilson nodded grimly. The unit had captured Nazi propaganda leaflets depicting black American soldiers as monsters and rapists. One particularly vicious poster showed a Simeonized black soldier carrying away German women and children. "Intelligence says there's a hidden munitions factory somewhere in the town," Wilson said. "And something else. Some kind of labor camp on the outskirts. Command wants us to secure both." Lieutenant William Peterson, a white officer who commanded their platoon, approached Wilson's tank. "All right, men. We move in 30 minutes. Remember, we're looking for military targets and personnel only. There are civilians in there, including women and children. I don't want any mistakes." "Yes, sir," Wilson replied, knowing that, as always, his unit would be held to a higher standard than others. One misstep, one civilian casualty, and the narrative about savage black soldiers would seem confirmed. The 761st had fought with distinction since landing in France, But they were still fighting two wars, one against the Germans and another against prejudice within their own army. As the tanks rumbled toward Nordhausen, Wilson thought about his home in Georgia and the irony of his current mission. He was risking his life to liberate people who had been taught to fear and hate him because of his skin color, not unlike the America he had left behind. In her cellar, Margareta heard the distinctive sound of tank treads grinding over rubble. The noise grew louder, accompanied by voices shouting in English. Frau Meyer began to sob quietly, clutching her daughter Lena protectively. "They're here," whispered Herr Schmidt, the eldest of the group. "Everyone remember, no sudden movements. The women should cover their heads." Margaret pulled a threadbare scarf over her light brown hair and instructed Johann and Elsa to stay behind her. She had hidden what few valuables remained, her wedding ring and a silver necklace, in the lining of her coat. Suddenly, the cellar door above them creaked open. Dust and weak daylight spilled down the stairs. Heavy boots descended, and flashlight beams cut through the gloom. Margaret's heart pounded as she saw them. American soldiers, their uniforms dusty, rifles at the ready. And among them, as she had feared, were black faces. "Clear," called one soldier in English. Then in broken German, "Civilians here, women and children." Margaret instinctively pushed her children further behind her as a tall black soldier approached. His uniform patch showed a Black Panther, and the name Wilson was stitched on his jacket. "It's okay, ma'am," he said, in surprisingly good German. "We're not going to hurt you or your children. Is anyone injured?" Margaret was too stunned to respond. The soldier's manner contradicted everything she had been told to expect. He kept a respectful distance, his rifle pointed down. Another soldier, this one white, joined him. "Sergeant Wilson, tell them we need to evacuate this building. It's not structurally sound. And we've found unexploded ordnance nearby." Wilson nodded and translated. "You need to come with us. This building could collapse. We have a safe area set up in the town square." "I'm not going anywhere with them," hissed Frau Meyer, her eyes darting fearfully between the soldiers. "Especially not with those ones." She didn't need to specify which soldiers she meant. Herr Schmidt, however, slowly stood up. "We have no choice," he said quietly. "Look around you. We have no food, no water. The Reich is finished." As if to emphasize his point, a distant explosion shook dust from the ceiling. Elsa began to cry, and Johann wrapped a protective arm around his sister. "Your children need food and medical attention," Wilson said gently to Margaret. "We have both. Please, trust us." Something in his eyes, a genuine concern that couldn't be faked, made Margaret hesitate. She looked at her children's dirty faces, their hollow cheeks. Whatever happened, she couldn't let them starve in this cellar. "We will come," she finally said, rising to her feet with as much dignity as she could muster. Wilson offered his hand to help the elderly Frau Schmidt up the stairs, while other soldiers assisted Frau Weber with her toddler. Outside, Margareta gasped at the extent of destruction. The street she had known all her life was now barely recognizable. American tanks and jeeps were positioned at intersections, and soldiers were systematically checking buildings. "This way," Wilson directed them, pointing toward the town square where Red Cross tents had already been erected. As they walked, Margaret noticed other groups of civilians being escorted from their hiding places. Some looked terrified, others relieved, but none appeared to have been mistreated. At the square, military doctors and nurses were treating injuries and distributing food. To Margaret's surprise, many of the medical personnel were also Black Americans, including a female nurse who immediately approached them. "I'm Lieutenant Rose Washington," she introduced herself through an interpreter. "Let's get these children checked out." As Elsa and Johann received their first proper medical examination in months, Margareta watched in confused silence. Lieutenant Washington was gentle with the children, smiling and even making Johann laugh as she listened to his heart. She gave them each a chocolate bar, the first sweet thing they had tasted in over a year, and provided Margaret with packets of powdered milk and canned rations. "Your daughter is malnourished but otherwise healthy," Washington told Margaret. "Your son has a respiratory infection that needs treatment. We'll provide antibiotics." Margaret nodded numbly, struggling to reconcile the kind professional woman before her with the monstrous caricatures from Nazi propaganda. As evening approached, the Americans established a temporary shelter in the town school, which had miraculously remained mostly intact. Families were given classroom spaces, with cots and blankets provided by the army. That night, as her children slept soundly for the first time in weeks, Margaret sat by a window watching the American soldiers patrol the streets. She noticed Technical Sergeant Wilson speaking with a group of officers, gesturing toward the northern edge of town. Something in their manner suggested urgency. At dawn, Margaret was awakened by increased activity. More military vehicles had arrived during the night, including ambulances and trucks. Wilson and several other soldiers from the 761st were preparing to move out. "What's happening?" she asked an interpreter. "They found it," the man replied grimly. "The camp, Dora Mittelbau." Margaret felt her blood run cold. Everyone in Nordhausen knew of the camp's existence on the outskirts of town, though most pretended not to. The underground factory where V-2 rockets were manufactured using slave labor from the Mittelbau Dora concentration camp was the region's dark secret. "It's bad," the interpreter continued. "Thousands dead, others barely alive. They're bringing survivors here for medical care." By midday, the school had been transformed into an emergency hospital. The sight of the camp survivors, skeletal, hollow-eyed people, barely recognizable as human, shocked even those Germans who claimed they hadn't known the camp's true nature. American photographers documented everything, sometimes forcing reluctant townspeople to witness what had been done in their name. Sergeant Wilson returned looking years older, his uniform covered in dirt. He had been part of the team that first entered the camp, discovering over 300 corpses and a few hundred survivors who were more dead than alive. The experience had marked him deeply. Margaret watched as Wilson sat alone in a corner of the schoolyard, his head in his hands. Against her better judgment, she approached him, offering a cup of the weak coffee the Americans had distributed. "Thank you," he said, accepting the cup with surprise. "No," she replied softly. "Thank you for what you are doing for those people, and for my children." A week passed, during which the Americans established more permanent aid distribution and medical facilities. The presence of black American soldiers became an everyday sight in Nordhausen, and despite initial fears, not a single incident of mistreatment of civilians had occurred. In fact, it was these soldiers who often seemed most sympathetic to the German civilians, perhaps recognizing in their situation echoes of oppression they understood all too well. Johann had become particularly attached to Sergeant Wilson, following him around whenever possible. Wilson taught the boy simple English phrases and sometimes let him sit atop his tank, much to Margaret's initial discomfort. But she couldn't deny the positive effect the soldier's kindness had on her son, who had spoken barely a word since news of his father's disappearance. On April 23rd, a new crisis emerged. Intelligence reports indicated that die-hard SS units were regrouping in the forests outside Nordhausen, possibly planning a counterattack. More concerning were reports that Hitler youth groups, fanatically loyal to the dying regime, were operating in the area. That evening, Margaret overheard Wilson speaking with Lieutenant Peterson. "Sir, we've got confirmation from local sources. There's a Hitler youth camp about 15 kilometers from here. They've got at least 30 kids, some as young as 12, and they're arming them for a last stand." Peterson shook his head in disgust. "Jesus, they're going to get those kids killed for nothing." "There's something else," Wilson continued. "Our informant says some of those kids were taken from this town, not volunteers taken. When their parents objected, they were threatened." Margaret gasped involuntarily, drawing the men's attention. "Mrs. Hoffman," Wilson said, switching to German, "do you know anything about this?" Margaret hesitated. There had been rumors. 3 boys from Johann's school had disappeared 2 weeks before the Americans arrived. Their parents had been told the boys were being evacuated to safety, but Frau Krause had confided that her son had been taken by Hitler youth leaders after her husband objected to the boy being drafted for the Volkssturm, the hastily organized people's militia. "There were boys taken," she finally admitted, "from our neighborhood. The Kraus boy, the Weber twins." Lieutenant Peterson listened intently as Wilson translated. "We need to find that camp before those fanatics lead those kids into a massacre." The next morning, a specialized reconnaissance team was assembled. To Margaret's surprise, Wilson sought her out before departing. "We could use your help," he said directly. "These kids might not trust us. Having a German mother along could make a difference." Margaret was torn. The thought of leaving Johann and Elsa terrified her, but the idea of other mothers' children being sacrificed in a pointless last stand was equally unbearable. "My children. Lieutenant Washington has agreed to watch over them personally. They'll be safe." After a long internal struggle, Margaret agreed. "I will help you bring those boys home." The reconnaissance team consisted of Wilson, 2 other soldiers from the 761st, a white lieutenant named Richardson, who spoke fluent German, and Margaret. They traveled in a jeep, dressed in civilian clothes over their uniforms to avoid immediate detection. Margaret wore her old coat and headscarf, looking like any other German mother searching for food or relatives in the countryside. As they drove through the devastated landscape, Margaret found herself seated beside Wilson. Curiosity finally overcame her reticence. "Your German is very good. How did you learn?" Wilson kept his eyes on the road. "My grandfather was a scholar, taught languages at a small college in Alabama. He believed education was the only way forward for our people, taught me German and French starting when I was 5. And yet you are a soldier." Wilson gave a mirthless laugh. "Didn't have much choice, but I believed in what we were fighting for. Still do, despite everything. Despite how people treat you, even in your own army." Margaret had seen how some white American soldiers maintained their distance from the men of the 761st. "Freedom isn't free, ma'am, not for anyone." After a pause, he added, "And sometimes the people who understand its value most are the ones who've had to fight for it hardest." The conversation fell silent as they approached the area where the Hitler Youth Camp was reportedly located. Lieutenant Richardson directed them to pull off the main road onto a forest path. "We'll continue on foot from here," he said, retrieving his rifle from beneath a blanket in the jeep. They moved cautiously through the pine forest, Richardson leading with Wilson and Margaret following, the other 2 soldiers covering their flanks. After about 2 kilometers, Wilson raised his hand, signaling everyone to stop. Through the trees ahead, they could see a clearing with several large tents and a few wooden structures. Young boys in Hitler Youth uniforms were visible, some carrying rifles that looked too large for them. "I count at least 20 kids," whispered Richardson, "and 4 adults, probably SS or fanatical Hitler Youth leaders." Margaret scanned the faces of the boys, recognizing several from Nordhausen. Her heart sank seeing how young some of them were. The youngest couldn't have been more than 12. "What's the plan, sir?" Wilson asked. "We need to get closer, assess their defenses and armaments, then we can call in a proper extraction team." As they were about to move forward, a commotion erupted in the camp. A boy was being dragged forward and forced to kneel before one of the adult leaders. Even from a distance, they could hear the man shouting accusations of cowardice. "That's Peter Kraus," Margaret whispered urgently. "Frau Kraus's son." To their horror, the leader drew a pistol and pointed it at the boy's head. "He's going to execute him," Wilson said. "We have to act now." Without waiting for orders, Wilson removed his civilian coat, revealing his uniform underneath. Before anyone could stop him, he stood and shouted in authoritative German, "Attention! This area is surrounded by American forces. Put down your weapons immediately." The camp froze in confusion. The adult with the pistol turned, momentarily distracted from the kneeling boy. Lieutenant Richardson, realizing there was no turning back, signaled to the other soldiers to reveal themselves at different points around the clearing, giving the impression of a larger force. "All children will not be harmed if they put down their weapons now," Wilson continued. "This is your only warning." The bluff created just enough confusion for Peter Kraus to scramble away from his would-be executioner. 2 of the adult leaders raised their weapons, but before they could fire, precise shots from Richardson and the other American soldiers dropped them. The remaining 2 adults tried to rally the boys to fight, but Margaret stepped forward, removing her headscarf. "Boys of Nordhausen," she called out, "your parents sent us to bring you home. The war is lost. Don't throw your lives away." The sight of a German mother alongside American soldiers created visible confusion among the boys. Some immediately dropped their weapons, while others hesitated, looking to the remaining adult leaders for guidance. One of these men, a fanatical SS officer, grabbed the nearest boy as a shield and began backing toward the forest, shouting, "Death before dishonor! Remember your oath to the Führer!" Wilson, seeing the situation deteriorating, made a split-second decision. He handed his rifle to Richardson and walked slowly into the clearing with his hands raised. "Think about what you're doing," he said calmly to the SS officer. "This boy has his whole life ahead of him. The war is over. Hitler is cornered in Berlin. Don't add child murder to Germany's crimes." The SS officer's face contorted with rage at being addressed by a black soldier. "Back, Untermensch. One more step and the boy dies." Wilson stopped but continued speaking, his voice steady. "I understand. You believe in something greater than yourself. So do I. That's why I'm fighting. But these children deserve a future, whatever that future holds. They deserve a chance to rebuild their country when this is over." While Wilson kept the officer's attention, Margarete circulated among the other boys, quietly urging them to put down their weapons and move toward the Americans. One by one they complied, the spell of fanaticism breaking in the face of a mother's practical concern. The standoff with the SS officer continued until a shot rang out. Not from any of the Americans, but from the last adult leader, who had decided to shoot himself rather than face capture. In that moment of distraction, the boy broke free from the SS officer's grip, and Richardson took a clean shot that dropped the Nazi before he could recover. As the echo of the final shot faded through the forest, an eerie silence fell over the clearing. 30 boys stood or sat in shock, suddenly looking very young without the facade of military purpose. "It's over," Wilson told them gently. "You're going home." When reinforcements arrived an hour later, they found Wilson, Margaret, and the other Americans sitting with the boys, distributing rations and listening to their stories. Some boys wept openly, admitting they had been terrified but too afraid to show it. Others remained stoic, their indoctrination still evident despite the day's events. As they prepared to transport the boys back to Nordhausen, Peter Kraus approached Wilson hesitantly. "Why did you do that?" he asked. "Walk out like that. He could have killed you." Wilson considered the boy thoughtfully. "Because sometimes you have to be willing to risk everything for what's right, and because every one of you deserves a chance at a better world than the one that sent you here." The boy nodded slowly, processing this. Then, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable days earlier, he extended his hand to the black American soldier. Wilson shook it firmly, meeting the boy's eyes with respect rather than condescension. In that simple exchange, something fundamental shifted, not just for Peter, but for Margarete, who watched it unfold. The convoy returned to Nordhausen by nightfall. Word of the rescue spread quickly through the town, and parents gathered anxiously at the school-turned-hospital, where the boys were brought for examination. Mothers sobbed with relief, as they embraced sons they had feared lost forever, while fathers stood awkwardly aside, many ashamed of their complicity in the regime that had nearly sacrificed their children. Frau Krause fell to her knees when she saw Peter, pulling him into a fierce embrace. When Wilson walked past, she grabbed his hand, unable to speak but her eyes conveying profound gratitude. Later that night, as Margarete tucked Johann and Elsa into their cots, Johann asked sleepily, "Is Sergeant Wilson a hero, Mutti?" Margarete glanced across the room to where Wilson sat writing a letter by lamplight, presumably to family back home. She thought about everything she had witnessed, his courage in the clearing, his compassion toward the rescued boys, his fundamental decency despite every reason to be bitter. "Yes," she said softly, "I believe he is." The rescue of the Hitler Youth boys transformed the atmosphere in Nordhausen. Where before there had been fearful avoidance between the German civilians and the black American soldiers, now there were cautious interactions, nods of acknowledgement, and even tentative gratitude. For Margarete Hoffmann, who had participated in the rescue, the change was more profound. The experience had forced her to confront not just the lies of Nazi propaganda about black Americans, but her own willingness to believe those lies. April 28, 1945. A week after the rescue mission, American military authorities organized a town meeting in Nordhausen's only remaining public hall. Captain Richard Donovan, the white officer commanding the occupation forces, addressed the assembled German civilians through an interpreter. "We're establishing a civilian administration to help restore basic services," he explained. "Water, food distribution, medical care. We need volunteers from the community to work with our military government." The hall remained silent. Despite the Americans' relatively humane treatment of the population, years of propaganda had left deep suspicions. Moreover, anyone seen cooperating too eagerly with the occupiers might face reprisals if, as some still believed possible, German forces eventually returned. Captain Donovan sighed, recognizing the reluctance. "The war is nearly over, ladies and gentlemen. Berlin will fall within days. Your community needs leadership now." From her seat near the back, Margaret studied the reactions around her. Most people stared at their laps or the floor. A few older men, those too old to have served in this war, whispered among themselves. Then, to her own surprise, Margaret found herself standing. "I will volunteer," she said clearly, "for the Children's Welfare Committee, if one is being formed." All eyes turned to her. Some faces showed respect, others suspicion or even contempt, but Margaret kept her chin high, thinking of the boys who had nearly died for a lost cause. Captain Donovan nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Frau Hoffmann. We'll certainly need someone to coordinate children's services." Her small act of courage seemed to break the dam. Herr Schmidt, the elderly man from her cellar shelter, stood next. "I was mayor of the Western District before the war. I can help with civilian administration." Others followed: a former schoolteacher, a doctor, a civil engineer. By the meeting's end, the framework of a provisional civilian government had been established, with American oversight but German participation. As the meeting dispersed, Technical Sergeant Wilson approached Margaret. "That was brave," he said simply. "Not everyone would have been first." Margaret adjusted her headscarf, uncomfortable with the praise. It wasn't bravery. It was necessity. The children cannot wait for pride or politics. Wilson smiled slightly. "That's usually when real bravery happens. Not for glory, but because something needs doing." Before Margaret could respond, Elsa came running up, Johann trailing behind her. The children had been in an adjoining room where American soldiers, including several black servicemen, had organized games and distributed simple refreshments. "Mutti! Sergeant Wilson! Look what we made!" Elsa held up a crude drawing of stick figures, a woman and two children holding hands with a tall soldier. Margaret felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment, but Wilson crouched down to examine the artwork with exaggerated seriousness. "That's very good, Elsa. Is that your family?" "Yes, and you, because Johann says you're our friend now." Wilson's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, a complex emotion Margaret couldn't quite identify. "That's a great honor," he told the girl solemnly before standing again. "I have patrol duties, but I'll see you folks tomorrow. We're setting up that children's clinic you'll be helping with, Frau Hoffmann." As Wilson walked away, Frau Meyer, who had been so terrified of the black soldiers in the cellar, approached Margaret with a disapproving expression. "You're being too familiar with them," she hissed. What would Klaus think if he returned? The mention of her missing husband stung, but Margaret met the woman's gaze steadily. "Klaus would think I did what was necessary to protect our children, and if you had seen what I saw at that camp, what those boys were being prepared for." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The rescued Hitler Youth boys had told their stories throughout the town. Many parents were now facing the uncomfortable truth of how close they had come to sacrificing their sons to a doomed cause. The next morning, Margareta reported to the school building that was being converted into a children's clinic and welfare center. Lieutenant Rose Washington was organizing medical supplies, while several German women Margareta recognized from the neighborhood sorted donated clothing. "Frau Hoffmann, thank you for coming," Washington greeted her. "We have several priority cases I'd like you to help with." The lieutenant led Margaret to a classroom where about a dozen children sat or lay on cots. Unlike Margaret's own children, who despite their hardship still looked relatively healthy, these children were clearly victims of severe neglect. Some had been found in abandoned buildings, others were refugees from the east fleeing the Soviet advance, and a few were survivors from Mittelbau-Dora, whose parents had died in the camp. We need someone to coordinate their care and help locate any surviving relatives, Washington explained. Your German efficiency would be appreciated. The slight smile softened what might have been taken as a criticism. Margaret surveyed the children with growing resolve. I'll need files for each child, documentation of where they were found, any known information about family, and we should publish lists in all towns within walking distance. Washington nodded approvingly. I knew you were the right person for this job. Sergeant Wilson spoke highly of you after the rescue mission. For the next several days, Margarete threw herself into the work of organizing the children's welfare system. She created a methodical process for registering displaced children, documenting their medical needs, and attempting to locate relatives. Throughout this work, she interacted regularly with the American medical personnel, including many black nurses and doctors whose professionalism and compassion continued to challenge her preconceptions. On May 2, 1945, news reached Nordhausen that Hitler was dead. The announcement was met with a strange, muted reaction from the German population, a mixture of disbelief, relief, and apprehension about the future. For many, including Margaret, there was also a dawning horror as more details emerged about the full extent of the regime's crimes. That evening, Sergeant Wilson found Margaret working late at the Children's Center, organizing files by lamplight. You should get some rest, he said from the doorway. Your own kids will be wondering where you are. Margaret shook her head. Johann and Elsa are having dinner with the Schmidts. I needed to finish these case files. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been troubling her all day. Is it true what they're saying about the camps? That there were hundreds of them, not just the one here? Wilson entered the room and sat heavily in a chair opposite her desk. Yes, our forces have been finding them throughout Germany and Poland, some worse than others. And everyone will blame all Germans, Margaret said quietly, even those of us who didn't know. Wilson studied her for a long moment. Did you really not know? Nothing at all. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she straightened a stack of papers. We knew there was a labor camp. We could sometimes see the prisoners being marched to the factory, but they told us they were criminals, saboteurs, enemies of Germany. She met his eyes directly. We chose to believe that because the alternative was too terrible, so perhaps we are all guilty of something, even if only of choosing not to see. Wilson nodded slowly. In America, we have a saying, all that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And good women? Margaret asked with a sad smile. Especially good women. In my experience, they're often braver than the men. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Peterson, who appeared in the doorway with an urgent expression. Wilson, we've got a situation. Major Howard needs the 761st for an emergency operation. Wilson stood immediately. What's happened? We've received intelligence that an SS detachment is hiding in an old mining facility about 20 kilometers from here. They've got hostages, children from a nearby village. They're threatening to collapse the mine with the children inside if we don't guarantee them safe passage to the west. Margaret gasped. The war was effectively over, yet the violence against the most innocent continued. How many children? Wilson asked. At least 15, according to our information, ages 4 to 12. Why would they do this now? Margaret asked, horrified. The war is lost. Peterson's expression was grim. Some of these SS units have convinced themselves they can still negotiate, or perhaps they just want to inflict final punishment on a population they believe betrayed the Reich. Either way, these particular children were taken from a village that surrendered to American forces without resistance. Wilson turned to Margarete. We'll need your help again. These children may be traumatized. Having a German mother figure present could make all the difference. Margaret didn't hesitate this time. Of course. Let me just send word to the Schmidts to keep Johann and Elsa overnight. Within an hour, a convoy of vehicles from the 761st Tank Battalion was moving through the dark Thuringian countryside. Margarete rode in a jeep with Wilson, Peterson, and a German civilian named Otto Weber, who knew the mining area well and had volunteered to guide them. The main shaft extends about half a kilometer into the hillside, Weber explained, pointing to a crude map spread across his knees. There are side tunnels where they used to extract copper, but many are unstable now. If they've rigged explosives. He didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone understood the catastrophic potential. How many SS are we dealing with? Wilson asked Peterson. Intelligence suggests a unit of about 20 men under the command of an Obersturmbannführer named Heller. Apparently, he's a true believer, thinks the Reich can still negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies against the Soviets. Margarete shuddered at the name. Heller was known even before the war. He was one of the early Nazi organizers in Thuringia, a brutal man. As they approached the mining complex, all lights were extinguished, and the vehicles proceeded slowly. The convoy halted a kilometer from the site, and the soldiers continued on foot, with Margaret and Weber accompanying a specialized squad that included Wilson and Peterson. The mine entrance was illuminated by a single floodlight, revealing 2 armed SS guards. From their position in the tree line, the Americans could see that the entrance had been fortified with sandbags and what appeared to be explosive charges. "We need to establish communication," Peterson whispered. "Find out exactly what they want." A plan was formulated. Peterson would approach under a white flag with Wilson as his radio operator and Margaret as translator. The rest of the force would remain hidden, ready to act if negotiations failed. As they approached the mine entrance with hands visible, the SS guards raised their weapons. "Halt!" one shouted. "Come no closer." Peterson stopped, holding the white flag higher. "We're here to talk," he called in English with Margaret translating. "About the children." After a tense moment, one guard disappeared into the mine. Several minutes later, a tall officer emerged. Obersturmbannführer Heller himself, his uniform immaculate despite the circumstances. His cold eyes registered first surprise, then disgust at the sight of Wilson. "You send a black to negotiate?" he asked in accented English, deliberately avoiding looking directly at Wilson. Peterson's expression remained professional. "Technical Sergeant Wilson is one of my best men, and Frau Hoffmann is here to assist with the children once we reach an agreement." Heller smirked at Margarete. "A German woman consorting with Americans, and Negro-Americans at that. How the mighty Aryan race has fallen." Margaret felt a flash of anger, but maintained her composure. "The children, Herr Obersturmbannführer, they are innocent in all this." "No German is innocent, according to your new American friends," Heller replied bitterly. "But these children will live if my terms are met. My men and I require safe transport to the American zone, away from the approaching Russians. Once there, we will reveal the location of several high-value Nazi officials and scientific assets that would be of great interest to your government." Peterson exchanged a glance with Wilson. The offer was clearly designed to appeal to emerging Cold War tensions. "I don't have the authority to guarantee such terms," Peterson said carefully, "but I can communicate your offer to my superiors while we secure the children's immediate safety." Heller laughed harshly. "How naive do you think I am, Lieutenant? The children remain our insurance until we are safely beyond Soviet reach." As the negotiation continued, Wilson noticed a small movement at the mine entrance behind Heller. A child's face, a boy no more than 6, had appeared briefly in the shadows before being pulled back by someone inside. The glimpse was enough to confirm the hostages were indeed in the mine, and at least some were still alive. Margaret had seen it too. She took a step forward, ignoring Peterson's warning glance. "Please," she addressed Heller directly, "as a German mother, I beg you, release the children as a show of good faith. Surely honorable German soldiers do not hide behind children." It was a calculated appeal to Heller's warped sense of honor. His face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, a new complication arose. From within the mine came the sound of a child's terrified scream, followed by a gunshot. "What was that?" Peterson demanded, his hand moving toward his sidearm. Heller's expression betrayed nothing. "Discipline must be maintained, even among the young." The implication that a child might have been shot caused Wilson to step forward involuntarily, his fists clenched. "Oh, son of a—" Peterson cut him off with a sharp gesture. "We need proof the children are unharmed, all of them." "You are not in a position to make demands," Heller said coldly. What happened next occurred with such speed that later Margaret would struggle to recall the exact sequence. A child, the same boy Wilson had glimpsed earlier, suddenly bolted from the mine entrance, running frantically toward the Americans. One of the SS guards raised his rifle. Wilson, reacting instantly, threw himself forward, tackling the child to the ground as a shot rang out. In the next moment, the night erupted in gunfire. American snipers positioned in the trees eliminated the external guards, while Heller dove back into the mine entrance. Peterson pulled Margareta down behind a boulder as bullets whizzed overhead. When the initial exchange subsided, Margaret looked frantically for Wilson. He had rolled with the child into a shallow depression, shielding the boy with his body. Now he lay still, and in the harsh beam of the floodlight she could see a dark stain spreading across the back of his uniform. "Wilson!" she screamed, trying to move toward him. Peterson held her back. "Stay down, medic!" he shouted into his radio. "Man down near the entrance!" Inside the mine, Heller's voice echoed, "That's a taste of what will happen. One child will die every 10 minutes until our demands are met." The situation had deteriorated catastrophically. With Wilson wounded and the SS now demonstrably willing to harm the children, the Americans faced an impossible dilemma. A frontal assault might save some hostages, but would almost certainly result in others being killed, while continued negotiations seemed unlikely to succeed. As a medic crawled forward to reach Wilson and the boy, Margaret made a decision. "I need to go in," she told Peterson. "That's suicide," he replied immediately. "I'm a German mother. He may listen to me or at least let me tend to the children while you continue negotiations." She swallowed hard. "And I know these mines. My father worked here before the war. There's another entrance, a ventilation shaft, that they might not know about." Peterson hesitated, clearly torn. "It's too dangerous." "Every minute we wait is dangerous for those children," Margaret countered. "Let me try." After a moment's deliberation, Peterson agreed to a modified plan. Margaret would approach the main entrance offering medical assistance to the children, while a specialized team, guided by Weber, would attempt to access the mine through the secondary entrance Margaret had described. Before she left their shelter, Margaret glanced toward where the medic was working on Wilson. The soldier lay motionless, his blood darkening the spring soil. The boy he had saved was crying quietly as another soldier kept him secure behind cover. "Tell Sergeant Wilson," Margaret said softly to Peterson, "that my children will know what he did here today." With her hands raised, Margaret walked slowly toward the mine entrance, calling out in German, "Obersturmbannführer Heller, I am a nurse. I'm coming to help with the children. I am unarmed." After a tense moment, Heller's voice responded, "Come forward slowly. Any tricks and the children die." As Margaret entered the dim interior of the mine, the horror of the situation became fully apparent. 15 children, ranging from preschool age to early adolescence, were huddled against one wall, guarded by SS men with machine guns. Some children whimpered softly, others sat in shocked silence. A teenage girl cradled a smaller child who appeared to be injured. Heller stood before them, his pistol drawn. "So, the Americans send a traitor to plead their case." Margaret kept her voice calm and dignified. "I'm a mother, not a politician. These children need water, food, and medical attention. They'll get it when we get our transport. Please, at least let me tend to the injured ones while you negotiate." Heller considered this, then nodded curtly. "Very well. But remember that their lives depend on your good behavior." Margaret moved among the children, offering quiet words of reassurance as she assessed their condition. Most were dehydrated and terrified but physically unharmed. The injured child had a bullet graze on his arm, apparently the source of the scream they had heard earlier. As she worked, Margaret took careful note of the mine's layout, the positions of the SS men and potential escape routes. She estimated there were 18 SS soldiers remaining, all heavily armed but increasingly nervous. Several exhibited the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much combat and had nothing left to lose. Meanwhile, outside the mine, the situation with Wilson had taken a dire turn. The bullet had struck him in the upper back, and he had lost significant blood. As medics worked frantically to stabilize him, he drifted in and out of consciousness. "The children," he mumbled, trying to sit up. Did we get them out? Not yet, Peterson told him, pressing him gently back down. But we will. Frau Hoffmann is helping. Wilson managed a weak smile. Brave woman. Save your strength, Sergeant. That's an order. Inside the mine, nearly an hour had passed. Margaret had done what she could for the children, creating a small area where they sat together, drawing comfort from physical proximity. She had positioned herself between them and the SS guards, a human shield of limited practical value but significant symbolic importance. Heller paced impatiently, checking his watch. Your American friends are testing my patience. Perhaps another demonstration is needed. They're organizing your transport, Margaret improvised quickly. These arrangements take time. Time is the one thing we don't have, Heller replied ominously. The Russians are less than 50 kilometers away. As if on cue, the sound of distant explosions rumbled through the mine shaft. Everyone tensed, but it was merely distant artillery fire, the war's final spasms playing out elsewhere. The distraction, however, provided the opening the American infiltration team had been waiting for. Having entered through the ventilation shaft Margarete had described, they had methodically worked their way through the mine's secondary tunnels. Now they were in position, waiting for the signal to act. That signal came in an unexpected form. One of the youngest children, a 5-year-old girl, suddenly broke from the group and ran toward the mine entrance, screaming for her mother. An SS guard instinctively raised his rifle, but Margaret threw herself forward, grabbing the child and covering her with her body. "No!" she shouted at the guard. "Enough! These are German children, our children! Is this what we've become, murderers of our own future?" Her words, ringing with genuine maternal outrage, caused a moment's hesitation among some of the SS men. In that crucial pause, the American infiltration team struck. Stun grenades detonated at strategic points throughout the mine, temporarily blinding and disorienting the SS forces. What followed was a carefully orchestrated extraction rather than a firefight. The Americans had wisely prioritized the hostages' safety over engaging the enemy. Special Forces operators moved swiftly among the confused SS men, neutralizing threats with precision, while others gathered the children and moved them toward emergency exits. Margaret, still sheltering the young girl who had inadvertently triggered the rescue, found herself being pulled to safety by an American soldier she didn't recognize. "Come on, ma'am, we need to move now." In the chaos, Heller and several of his men managed to retreat deeper into the mine, setting off pre-planted explosive charges that collapsed sections of tunnel behind them. The Americans prioritized evacuating the children and Margarete rather than pursuing the fleeing Nazis. Outside, the night air felt impossibly sweet after the mine's dank confines. Medical personnel immediately surrounded the rescued children, checking for injuries and providing water and blankets. Parents from the nearby village, who had been waiting anxiously behind American lines, rushed forward with cries of relief and joy, creating scenes of reunion that brought tears even to the eyes of hardened soldiers. Margaret searched the busy scene for Wilson, but couldn't find him. Finally, she approached Lieutenant Peterson, who was coordinating the evacuation. "Sergeant Wilson," she asked urgently. "How is he?" Peterson's expression was grave. "They've evacuated him to a field hospital. The bullet missed his spine but caused significant damage. He's lost a lot of blood." "Will he survive?" "If anyone can, it's Deacon Wilson," Peterson said, using the sergeant's nickname for the first time in Margaret's hearing. "He's the toughest soldier I know." The following days passed in a blur of activity. The children rescued from the mine received medical and psychological care, while American forces continued their hunt for Heller and his remaining men. Margaret threw herself into her work at the Children's Welfare Center, but her thoughts often strayed to Wilson, fighting for his life in an American military hospital. On May 7, 1945, news arrived that Germany had surrendered unconditionally to the Allied powers. The announcement brought no celebration in Nordhausen, only a collective exhale, as if the entire population had finally been granted permission to breathe again. That afternoon, Margaret received word that she could visit Wilson at the field hospital that had been established in a requisitioned school building in a neighboring town. She took Johann and Elsa with her, bringing a small bunch of wildflowers the children had insisted on gathering. Wilson lay on a hospital bed, his upper body heavily bandaged, his normally robust frame noticeably thinner. but his eyes brightened when he saw Margarete and the children at the door. "Well, look who's here," he said, his voice weaker than she remembered, but his spirit undimmed. "The Hoffman family." Johann rushed forward, stopping just short of the bed when Margarete cautioned him not to jostle the patient. "Sergeant Wilson, did you really get shot saving a little boy?" Wilson exchanged an amused glance with Margarete. "News travels fast." "Everyone's talking about it," Elsa chimed in, solemnly presenting the wildflowers. "The children from the mine told us. They said you and Mutti are heroes." "Your mother is the real hero," Wilson corrected gently. "I just did my job." A nurse appeared, checking Wilson's bandages. "You're a popular man, Sergeant. There's a whole delegation of German mothers outside wanting to thank you personally, but the doctor says only short visits for now." After the nurse left, Wilson turned serious. "They caught Heller yesterday. He and 3 others were trying to escape dressed as farmers. Poetic justice. He was turned in by actual German farmers who recognized him." "What will happen to him?" Margarete asked. "He'll face trial for war crimes. There's evidence connecting him to atrocities at Mittelbau-Dora and elsewhere." A silence fell between them, filled with the weight of all that had happened and all that had been revealed about the regime many Germans had supported or tolerated. "What happens now?" Margarete finally asked. "To Germany, I mean." Wilson shifted slightly, wincing with the effort. "Rebuilding, justice where possible, and hopefully learning." He looked directly at Johann and Elsa. "These children will grow up in a different Germany than the one you and I have known, Frau Hoffmann. That's something worth fighting for." Margarete nodded, feeling tears threatening. "Thank you, not just for what you did at the mine, but for—" She struggled to articulate the profound shift in her worldview that his example had catalyzed. Wilson seemed to understand. "We all have prejudices to overcome, Margarete, on both sides of the ocean." Johann, with a child's directness, asked the question that had been on his mind. "Will you go back to America soon?" A shadow crossed Wilson's face. "Yes, once I'm well enough to travel. My war is over." "Will you come back someday?" Elsa asked. "To visit us?" "I'd like that," Wilson said, though his tone suggested he understood the complexities such a visit would entail in either country. Their time was cut short by the return of the nurse, indicating that Wilson needed rest. As the Hoffmans prepared to leave, Wilson called Margarete back for a final word. "There's something I want you to have, Iggy," he said, reaching painfully for a small notebook on his bedside table. "It's my record of what I've seen since landing in Europe. Not just the fighting, but the people, the places, the good and the bad. I've written about Nordhausen, about the camp, about the children we rescued." He paused. "And about brave German mothers who chose to do what was right when it mattered most." Margarete accepted the notebook with trembling hands. "I don't know what to say. Just promise me something. When enough time has passed and people start to forget or deny what happened here, show them this. Tell them the truth. All of it." "I promise," Margarete whispered. 2 weeks later, Technical Sergeant James Deacon Wilson was transported to a larger medical facility in France, the first step in his long journey home to Georgia. Before leaving, he was awarded the Silver Star for his actions during the mine rescue operation. Several German mothers, including Margarete, attended the small ceremony, their presence raising eyebrows among some American officers, but drawing approving nods from the men of the 761st. The American occupation of Nordhausen continued through the summer of 1945, but in July, according to agreements made at Yalta, Thuringia was transferred to Soviet control. Many civilians, including Margarete and her children, chose to leave before the Red Army arrived, heading west into what would become the American occupation zone. Before departing, Margarete visited the town cemetery, where a memorial had been erected for the victims of Mittelbau-Dora. Among the flowers and candles left by mourners, she placed a small hand-carved wooden soldier that Johann had made, a figure with distinctively dark features, standing tall and proud in an American uniform. In October 1945, Margarete received a letter forwarded through American military channels. It was from Wilson, now back home in Georgia. He wrote of his ongoing recovery, of the strange experience of returning to American segregation, after fighting for freedom abroad, and of his plans to use the GI Bill to complete his education. He asked about the children, both her own and those they had rescued together. "The world is changing," he wrote in closing, "not fast enough perhaps, but changing nonetheless. What happened in Nordhausen, Germans and Americans, black and white finding common humanity amid the rubble of hate, that gives me hope. Hold on to that hope, Margaret. Teach it to your children. It's the only way forward for any of us." Margaret did exactly that. Throughout the difficult years of rebuilding, through the Berlin airlift and the Cold War tensions that followed, she kept Wilson's notebook safe, occasionally reading portions to her children as they grew. When Johann asked difficult questions about the Nazi era, she answered truthfully, neither minimizing German guilt nor allowing it to become a paralyzing shame that prevented moving forward. In 1965, 20 years after the war's end, Margarete received an unexpected visitor at her small bookshop in Frankfurt. A tall, distinguished man with graying temples stood in the doorway, accompanied by a younger man who was unmistakably his son. "Frau Hoffmann," the man said with a familiar voice, "I believe I promised a little girl named Elsa that I would visit someday." "Sergeant Wilson," Margaret breathed, scarcely believing her eyes. "Or is it Professor Wilson now? I read about your appointment in your letters." James Wilson smiled, the same warm expression she remembered despite the passing years. "Just James to old friends." He gestured to the young man beside him. "This is my son, Marcus. He's studying international relations at university. I thought it was time he saw Germany, the real Germany, not the one in history books." As they embraced, 20 years of correspondence and shared history, bridging the physical distance that had separated them, Margaret felt the completion of a circle. From fear to respect, from respect to friendship, their journey mirrored the painful but necessary reconciliation between former enemies that was still unfolding across Europe. Later that evening, over dinner with Margaret's family, including Johann, now a journalist, and Elsa, a medical student, Wilson recounted for Marcus the story of those fateful weeks in 1945. "The propaganda told German mothers to fear black American soldiers," he explained. "And honestly, plenty of white Americans believed we weren't fit for combat either. But when those children needed rescuing, it wasn't about color or nationality anymore. It was about doing what was right. And that," Margaret added softly, "is what I hope the world remembers from those terrible years. Not just the darkness that humans are capable of, but also the light that shines through, even in the darkest times." The two families stayed in contact over the decades that followed. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Margarete, by then an elderly woman, received a phone call from America. It was Wilson, his voice cracking with emotion, as they shared the moment of witnessing history heal another wound. "We lived to see it, Margaret," he said. "A Germany whole again. Thanks to people like you who saw our humanity when we had almost lost sight of it ourselves," she replied. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, a special ceremony was held in what had once been Nordhausen. Among the honored guests were a few surviving members of the 761st Tank Battalion, including a 95-year-old James Wilson, and several German civilians who remembered the American liberation, including Margaret Hoffmann. Together, they unveiled a small monument commemorating not just the military victory, but the human connections that had flourished amid the ruins of war. The inscription, in German and English, read simply, "To those who taught us that courage knows no color and that humanity transcends borders, from the mothers and children of Nordhausen with eternal gratitude." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.